How's it going, everybody? It's Riley's Red Zone here, and in today's video, I'm going to be giving my fantasy football rankings. In this video, it's the quarterbacks. Who are the top quarterbacks available? Who are some potential late round sleepers? Who are some busts you should avoid? So in this video, my rankings are based off of tiers, so I'm going to break down each tier and the quarterbacks that fall into that category, and by the end, we'll have talked about all the available players, and my hope is that by watching this video, I can help you win a league championship. So this is not overall quarterback rankings for the NFL. This is fantasy football to help you win your league. So with that being said, let's jump right into talking about the quarterbacks. These are some of the top guys you'll see coming off the board right at the beginning of the draft. So your top quarterbacks this year are going to be these three. You're going to see them separated at the top of your list. And that's going to be Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, and Justin Herbert. These are all safe bets at quarterback that you're going to have a great season out of them. I believe that probably all three of these guys will end up either in top 5 or maybe like top 8 or so. So you're going to get a great season as long as they're healthy. But I don't personally like taking quarterbacks super early in the draft. I'm not a huge fan of it. So I might say to not necessarily avoid the player, but I'm not going to go recommending for any of these players that you draft them super high in your league, sacrificing some potential depth at the running back or wide receiver position. So, starting with Josh Allen, I've been really high on the Bills 2 years in a row. I've predicted them before the season also to win the Super Bowl, and I thought they were really close last year. A coin toss goes differently or that game goes differently. They're almost there. So I think you can make a case that Josh Allen was maybe even the best quarterback, towards the end of the last season. And so he finished as he was the number 1 fantasy quarterback. And he's being drafted as that right now. That always happens every year. Now, we don't always see number 1 quarterbacks repeat. We've seen some other players end up as the QB1, and then so players like Mahomes and Lamar Jackson end up being selected first the next year after they finishes QB1. We don't always see that value completely return to that QB1, but most of the time they're definitely going to be in about the top 5. So if you pick Josh Allen, I personally would not be surprised for him to repeat, but there's a lot of other quarterbacks we're going to talk about in this video that might say the same. So I like Josh Allen a lot, but right now, according to the website I found, his ADP is 14.4. That's in the middle of the second round. No way am I touching that with a 10-foot pole, personally. I am not taking a quarterback that early in the draft, especially when I think there's a lot of value at the position this year. But I love Josh Allen as a fantasy option. I personally think he probably could end up as the QB1. Then I'm going to jump to Justin Herbert because I personally think he has a higher chance than Patrick Mahomes to be the QB1. I think Herbert is a great candidate to be that number 1. He's going to come in right now as the 3rd quarterback being taken. His ADP right now is about 32.7 for the pick, so you're talking, depending on the size of your league, kind of 3rd round-ish area, and that's another one where I'm probably going to pass on it, but if maybe he falls to the 4th or 5th, I might think about taking Justin Herbert. I think his potential upside is huge. That offense has a ton of firepower with Eckler and then Williams and Allen at receiver. I think the Chargers have a potential to be one of the best offenses in the league. And Justin Herbert, I truly think I think it's between him and Allen, personally, for who's going to be the QB1. Probably a little bit more of, risk reward on weeks, but I think that Justin Herbert is a great option at quarterback also. And Patrick Mahomes kind of lies in the middle. He's always been, since his MVP season, most of the time top 3 quarterback being taken, but a lot of times even the first quarterback taken in drafts. This year he's sitting at the QB2 right now. He finished as the QB4 last year, so maybe if you picked him as the first quarterback, you didn't get that value back. You still got a solid player, but Justin Herbert last year was not in this discussion to be picked early, and he ended up as the QB2. So I think that Mahomes being ahead of Herbert, I'm not going to take that. If I'm going to even take one, I'll wait and pick Herbert a little later. But Mahomes is probably the safest bet out of these guys to give you consistency. But I don't think he's going to end up as QB1 anymore, especially with Tyreek Hill out the game also. So out of these guys, I really like Allen and Herbert for players as a fantasy quarterback, but the thing is I don't think they're worth their ADP whatsoever. Maybe look at Herbert if he falls to that 4th or 5th round, but otherwise, I'm going to tell you to not necessarily take these guys. But if you end up in a spot where you want to have fun and pick a top quarterback to watch, maybe, to try something, pick one of these guys. If you're going to pick one early, pick one of these 3. But definitely, in my personal opinion, I would avoid taking these players at their current price. If they fall to a later spot, you definitely can. But these are your top 3 that you're going to get that top 5 value this season no matter what. Now, my second tier of quarterbacks is only going to include 2 players because they both are kind of the same thing where we're talking about mobility here. That's a big reason why Josh Allen was number 1 QB last year. But Kyler Murray and Lamar Jackson are on another level of mobility. The year that Lamar had 1,000 rushing yards, like that's what you're looking for in a running back. So to get that and all the quarterback points, I mean that's crazy value a few years ago. So he can do that again. These 2 have the potential to be the QB1. I think that realistically, Allen or Herbert is way more likely to do that, but you at least have some upside here. So if you miss out on those 3 guys and you're willing to take a chance, I think you could go with one of these 2. Now, last year, if you look at probably where people drafted them, maybe a little disappointed in their placing, but they both dealt with some injuries. Kyler ended up at the QB 10. He's currently being picked as the 6th quarterback. So you could say I have it a little bit above where the public views. Both are in the 50s for their ADP, so kind of that 5th round area. Another example where I'm probably not going to take them there, but if they fall to the 6th or 7th, maybe I'm starting to look at that. And so I do think that both have the great potential. Now, Kyler is hurt a lot with DeAndre Hopkins being out for the first 6 weeks. So I think that he might have to rely more on his feet, which might be actually better for fantasy purposes. And then same with Lamar, like losing Hollywood. But we've already known with Lamar, he can do a ton on the ground. So right now, Lamar's being picked as the QB5, Kyler's the QB6. They're both about where I have them there in the rankings, but a same situation where these guys are going to be a little bit more risky. So know if you take these guys, you could end up with the QB1. It'd probably be more likely for Kyler to come out of nowhere than Lamar repeat that one season a few years ago, but both had the potential to be the high-scoring quarterback. I personally don't think it's going to happen for either of these 2, but there's a chance. So if you miss out on the first 3 guys and you want to get a little risky, go with one of these 2. I'm personally not going to do it, but if you want to go for it, these are your upside picks in the top group. Now, this is personally, almost year after year, my bread and butter of quarterbacks in fantasy. I personally, most of the time, end up picking a veteran that slips through the cracks, that maybe gets just passed up on for these younger star players. And I do that because these guys, I called it the safety tier. These players are proven and they're very, very safe. They are going to deliver consistent basis. Now, I'm higher on a few of them I'll discuss than probably some other people, specifically, I would say Russell Wilson and probably Tom Brady too. But, I think that these guys, if you miss out on those 5, I'm personally skipping those 5 and picking one of these guys in the little bit of a later round. And to me, that's an absolute steal to get these guys. They're great value. I'll talk about Joe Burrow first. If I was doing straight up rankings, I would put him right at 6 or maybe even 5 above Lamar or Kyler, right there, which is where he's being picked right now. He's the QB4. He finished as the QB8 though last year, and I know he could still take a leap again, but I personally think that's a bit high. If you're going to take somebody that early, I'd rather pick the upside of Kyler or Lamar. But basically, I almost put, you'll see later in the video, the red arrow for when I'm way lower on a player than the public. He just missed that where I didn't quite have him that far down. But I personally am avoiding Joe Burrow. I think that he might score a lot of points. He's got Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. But I think given the ADP, I would rather take, if I'm going to pick a QB right now, he's being picked as the 4th one in the middle, kind of late 4th to 5th round with the 47th pick or so. If I'm going to take one that early, I'm taking somebody with higher upside. So I personally am going to pass on Joe Burrow this year in fantasy drafts unless he somehow slips. But let's jump to some other players. Let's talk about Aaron Rodgers. He right now lands right in the middle where I'd think about taking a quarterback, but I think I'll talk about the other two on the screen that I'm going to be drafting all over the place this year. Aaron Rodgers is the QB5 last season. Top 5 quarterback. He won the MVP again. Great consistency. He's being picked right now at the QB8, which is right about where I have him. I have him at QB7 or so. He's being picked with about the 63rd pick. That's a lot better. Personally, 6th round to get a potential top 5 quarterback with more consistency, I would do that any day over picking Joe Burrow in the 4th round or 5th round even. I'm going to take Aaron Rodgers in the 6th or 7th. So I think he's a solid option. Aaron Rodgers is going to perform again. He loses Davante Adams, which is why people might have him a little lower, but I still think he's going to put up a great fantasy performance. But I really want to focus, if I had to pick a quarterback that I think will win some people leagues this year based on where he's being drafted, I'm telling you, Tom Brady right now has to be my pick. I know you can keep saying year after year he's getting older, and probably at some point it will crack and Father Time could catch up. But right now, I have him at number 8 in my rankings, and he's being picked at the QB 13 with about the 90th pick. So if you're in a 10-man league, that's the 9th round. I mean, that is absolutely... I would do that a million times over picking any of these other quarterbacks at their current ADPs. I would definitely go that direction. He's being picked right now below Dak Prescott, Matthew Stafford, Jalen Hurts, even Trey Lance on the website I found for ADP. He finished as the QB3 last season. Tom Brady was a top 3 fantasy quarterback. I picked him in multiple leagues because he somehow just falls through, because everyone, once again, wants these younger quarterbacks, which, yes, he does not have the upside. But if I'm picking my personal strategy, I'm waiting on quarterback, and if I can just get consistent number 1 QB level play every week with a 9th round pick, I'm taking that, because he did better than Aaron Rodgers, who's getting picked, if you go by the math of ADP, like 3 rounds earlier, or at least 2. I'm waiting on Tom Brady every day. I would even pick him in the 7th or 8th round above his ADP right now. So I gave him the green arrow because I am higher on him than the public is. And so for that reason, I'm really recommending that Tom Brady will be a great fantasy option this season. So if I had to give, I think I'm the highest above the public on him than any other quarterback in this video. So if there's a player I'm pounding the table to recommend that you draft to win some championships, my player this year for quarterback is going to be Tom Brady. I truly think that's the best value at the quarterback position in fantasy football right now. And I put the blue dot on Russell Wilson because you'll see later red arrows. I'm right with the public on where he lands. Like, I have him at 9 and he's QB 10 on the ADP, but I really like him as an option. I'm not saying to necessarily pick him above his ADP or below, but I really like him as a good fantasy quarterback. I think his value is just about right where the QB position. Same thing where with the ADP, I'm probably just going to take Tom Brady with that spot and maybe even wait around later. But I think Russell Wilson is going to be a great option. I've picked him almost every year in a league I'm in because he just ends up same thing, kind of just slipping through. But I will say he had some not so great weeks last year. And so if I'm going to be picking a quarterback at around that level, once again, I'm taking Tom Brady all day. So I think Russell's going to be a really good option with Sutton and Judy out there at receiver. But I am once again recommending to you, if I had any quarterback to take in fantasy football, given their value, right now the best value is Tom Brady at his ADP. So that's my recommended from this slide. So if you miss out on the top 5 and you don't pick one, which is what I would recommend doing, and you end up in this situation, I would wait it out a bit and pick one of these guys. This is exactly, to me, where you want to be in fantasy football. I would recommend you get somebody out of these four. Then you're going to feel confident the whole year without paying a ton to get a quarterback, and you're also not entering territory where you're a little skeptical of who you have. But to me, that's right where I want to be, and I'm personally going to recommend Tom Brady out of this group. Okay, so now we enter tier 4, which is where these are decent players that you're going to be fine if you end up with one of these players at quarterback. Don't panic if the rest of the players on the last slide get drafted and you run into these players. These will be fine, startable players on a week-to-week basis that you'll just keep throughout the whole season. I personally think there's a huge drop-off from the last 4 guys to these 3. I also noted that if you want upside, I had to include Hurts in here because he does have very, very good upside, but I think that he's not quite as consistent as the other players. So you will be fine if the other quarterbacks get taken on the previous group and you end up with one of these. If all those other guys go, you do need to just take one of these guys, even if it's a reach, to end up with a solid quarterback. Now, I will say on all 3 of these guys, I'm probably a little lower than the public is on them. I loved Matthew Stafford last year as a value pick, and I think that turned out pretty well for people. I don't think I ended up with him in any leagues, but he ended up being the QB6 last year, and there's no reason he can't repeat that. He still has all the weapons on that offense with Cooper Kupp specifically, and now they bring in Allen Robinson, which is, kind of, in my opinion, an upgrade over Robert Woods. They're really, really close. I think it's something different. So I like Matthew Stafford as an option. He's being picked right now as the 9th quarterback. Little high to me to be picking above Russell Wilson and Tom Brady specifically, but I think that he performed really, really well last year. I don't think he'll quite reach that top 6 level, but I think he'll be a top 10 quarterback again, probably borderline, for sure top 12. So Stafford's a great choice at quarterback if you miss out on the other 4. Not quite as good as them, but solid option. Now, Dak is a player I've avoided for years personally. I just have never quite found that point with him where it's a good value, because it's still the same thing where he's currently the QB 11, which I guess is better value. Here you're talking like almost 8th round, and that's pretty solid. But once again, if I have Brady on the board, I'm taking him any day of the week over Dak Prescott. I just think that last year, he had a lot of members on that offense, and he finished as the QB7. I know he has some mobility, but I personally just don't think the top 5 upside is there. So even if I'm picking somebody in that range, I'll take Jalen Hurts. I'm not a Jalen Hurts fantasy fan here. But Dak, to me, is just right in the middle of the road. If he slips, go ahead, take him. He's a solid option. I just personally wouldn't be taking him above a lot of other quarterbacks. But he finished as the QB7 last year again. But to me, that was a lot of things kind of went right for him. I doubt he even gets that high again this year. So I'm passing on Dak. And Jalen Hurts, let's talk about. I put the down arrow not because I think he's a bad fantasy option. I just have him quite significantly lower than the public. I just am a little afraid, and I know he has huge upside. I put that on the top of the screen there, so he has great upside. He could end up as a QB like top 5. He could. I love them bringing in A.J. Brown, and I talked about Devontae Smith last year when it came to the draft. I'm a huge fan of them. But I think Jalen Hurts more so than any other quarterback in the top, even probably like 18, maybe even 20 picks of quarterbacks. I think it's the highest chance of like getting replaced or maybe not playing well on the field. Because other sources have said this too. Like, he's one of those players that it kind of sometimes can hurt to watch, but he's always going to put up those fantasy numbers. So right now, for him to be being picked as the QB7, I just can't do it. I personally wouldn't even think about taking him over Brady, Rodgers, Wilson up there. I would personally take Stafford over him. I'd probably take him over Dak, but I'm off of that train. I'm not going to recommend, especially if you don't get other solid players on your roster. I'm not going to be sacrificing an early QB pick for Jalen Hurts. I just think you sacrifice some other positions there. If he was the same ADP as where Stafford is, I think I would consider that a lot better. But as current ADP, I'm avoiding Jalen Hurts right now. So once again, if those other guys get taken and you have to take one of these guys, it's fine. You'll have a decent fantasy quarterback. But these are all okay options at quarterback that hopefully for your starters, you end up with one of these 12 quarterbacks so far. Now we get to the part in the video, and you're saying, I didn't pick a quarterback yet. What would I do in this situation? Well, these are your next group of players that I think the cutoff ends here. You have a solid top 15 of startable every week players at quarterback. That's where the line is to me. Then you start getting some inconsistent players, but with high upside. But these guys are pretty safe. Trey Lance has some upside. I'll talk about him in a minute, but hopefully you end up with one of those top 12. But let's say you even follow my lead and you punt at the quarterback position. Honestly, good job if you get to this point. To me, it is better to end up with this and get some other depth at other positions than take a Jalen Hurts or a Dak Prescott earlier. So let's talk about Kirk first. ADP right now of the QB 14. He finished as the QB 11 last year. I mean, that is in most leagues startable, a QB 1. I mean, that's pretty impressive. I think that looking at his offense, it's kind of remained exactly the same, but maybe you get a step up with like Irv Smith coming back. So there's no reason to say he can't repeat again. And honestly, they're going to pass the ball more. I know Jefferson had a quote on that, but I think that is very, very true. So if anything, I think he'll repeat, maybe even be a little better. He might be pushing top 10 territory. So it's not a, glamorous pick if you end up with a Kirk Cousins. But it honestly is a solid option. For fantasy purposes, he takes care of the football. He'll score plenty of touchdowns. He has great weapons. He's a solid option. I mean, and if you look at, these guys are getting picked after the 100 or so range, he's a solid option. So I think that Kirk is a good option for fantasy purposes. And so is Derek Carr, not quite to that level. He was the QB 14 last year, getting picked as the QB 15. This is fine. He's the last guy I would probably take realistically as a starter if I had to. At that point, I would rather probably take somebody we'll talk about in a bit with some upside. But, hey, a top 15 secure, like he's going to be for sure top 16, top 18 for sure. That's kind of safe. Trey Lance. So Trey Lance is the same exact thing as Jalen Hurts, like a dead ringer, where you're picking them both for the mobility upside. And I personally, once again, have the red arrow because they're 3 ranks lower or more than what the public is currently viewing them. His current ADP is 12. I personally have him more towards the 14-15 range. I might even have him at 14 above Carr, but even so, I'm going to tell you to probably avoid him. I picked him last year in leagues thinking maybe there's a chance he plays. Currently it is 84 ADP. It's not bad. It's just with Tom Brady available kind of after that. But honestly, he's not too bad. I think you might come out happy ending up with Lance as your quarterback, but I'm basically, once again, I have the red arrow on him here just because I wouldn't pick him above some of the other quarterbacks that he currently could be being picked around. But I think that Lance is a solid option. And so that kind of cuts off at this point. If you don't end up with one of these 15 guys, it's probably not looking good. You maybe reached you didn't pick one too far. So now we're going to kind of enter a different tier of, hopefully, if you're going to end up picking one of these players, he's your backup, hopefully. Or just somebody that could eventually take over your starter. 2 names I just want to throw out here. Definition of mid. I don't really want to end up with either of these players, but if you have an absolute emergency and you're looking for a consistent starter, Matt Ryan, I think, will be a decent choice this year, actually, as overall. I mean, he goes into, to me, probably a better potential offense than what he would have had in Atlanta without Calvin Ridley or anything. So I think that he has potential to do well in Indianapolis. So he's currently being picked at the QB 16, I mean 12th, 13th round. That's pretty good value if you end up in an emergency. And in Tannehill, I don't want to come out with Tannehill as my starter after the draft, but I have him with the green arrow because I have him as about QB 17 for drafting purposes, and he's currently being picked at QB 23. So he's going to go undrafted in a lot of leagues. So if you end up in an absolute emergency, I honestly think he's fine. You might think about the run-heavy offense, and yeah, like Derrick Henry's a stud. I mean, he's amazing. And, but yes, this was with Henry hurt half the season, but Ryan Tannehill ended up as the QB 12 last year. That's a QB 1 in some leagues, in many, I would even say. So to me, just as throwing it out there, if you have an emergency, Ryan Tannehill is actually okay. If I had to end up with that, I'd be fine. But once again, hopefully you end up with one of those top 15 quarterbacks on the board. But these are just two names to throw out there as safe starters. So let's jump into the tiers 7 and 8 at this point in the video. You're looking at backup players here, but a lot of upside on this page. This entire page is really upside players. I personally think the top 3 could end up as QB1s if given the right situation this year. Jameis, I picked in, I think, a few leagues last year, the year before. But I think that Jameis, for fantasy purposes, if he can keep the turnovers down, I think he's actually a really solid option. I gave him the blue dot because I think that he's a player I actually really think would be a solid choice for a team if you're playing fantasy, but I didn't have him necessarily higher than the current ADP. But I think that he's a solid choice as a high upside player that you could stash him at the end of the draft and then wait a few weeks, and if for whatever reason your top quarterback isn't doing as well and James can keep the turnovers down and he's kind of doing well, you could play him on some weeks, and I think that could be a good call. Tua, I've been a huge Tua guy for a few years. I mean, as a fellow lefty, I want him to succeed. I was not expecting, though, when I opened up the page today to see him being as the QB 16 above some other players substantially. But, I can see it. He has Tyreek Hill now and Jalen Waddle still. I think Tua will have a really good season. I don't know about fantasy, though, is my only concern. I don't think he will have a crazy good fantasy season, but I really like Tua's upside for the overall NFL season, but that's not what today's video is about. So I have the down arrow on him because I just don't think I would personally at that point rather take Trevor Lawrence, or even we'll talk about Zach Wilson or Justin Fields. So I'm personally going to say pass on Tua, but if it gets super late and you need a backup, go ahead. Then Trevor Lawrence, I have as the QB 20, currently coming in at an ADP of 188 pick. I mean, that's way lower than even Jameis Winston. That's lower than Ryan Tannehill even from earlier. So I'm saying Trevor Lawrence, given a good offensive system now that's not Urban Meyer, and, some good, better weapons, they bring in Christian Kirk, and ETN being there now, I think Lawrence could really bounce back this year. I mean, I know he didn't do well statistically last year, but the flashes were there. I think he might be a solid backup option. I would personally recommend drafting him at the end of drafts. I mean, right now he'd be going in like the 18th or 19th round. He's going to be undrafted in most leagues. So if you need to stash a second quarterback, I might recommend him the most of any backup out there. I might say just take Trevor Lawrence for the upside. That is going to be one of my plays this year. I would say if I were the two players I'm probably higher than the average on this year are Tom Brady and Trevor Lawrence. And honestly, if I could get a draft ending with those two, with Brady in like the 9th or 10th, and then get Lawrence in the last round or so, just in case, I mean, that's a great way to end up. Mac Jones, don't really want to take him for fantasy purposes, but I did have him at 23, and he's getting picked at QB 26 above some interesting names, like even Mitchell Trubisky. But I don't avoid him for fantasy purposes, but if you really had to pick somebody down here, I'd pick him above Daniel Jones. But I technically am higher than the public on him, but I'm passing on Mac Jones. I love Zach Wilson. I love his play. I think he takes a huge step up this year. I don't know about fantasy purposes how much that will be, so I gave him the blue dot because same thing where I have him right at 21. His ADP is the 21 quarterback, but I do think he has a really, really good season. So if I'm picking a backup quarterback, in ignoring the first 16, if you can't get those, I'm personally in this order probably going Lawrence, probably Jameis and Wilson, given their value. Even though I have Tua higher, I think that the value of Wilson at that point is pretty good. But I think that Trevor Lawrence is a great value still. Justin Fields is kind of the same thing, but I don't think he has quite as good of a year. Just because he needs a little bit more time to actually be given a competent system on offense, and that might take him a bit for the team to kind of install that, especially now with a defensive head coach. And he also just has no weapons. I feel bad for the guy because he's a great quarterback, but they gave him nothing for receivers. I mean, he's going to be thrown to Byron Pringle besides Darnell Mooney. It's that's just, they need to surround him better. And then Daniel Jones has just been sitting here in the 20s for years. I don't think he ever gets out of it for fantasy purposes, so I would avoid Daniel Jones. There's really no reason to draft him. So my best value on this page, I would recommend you draft Trevor Lawrence as a backup. If you are going to take a backup quarterback, you don't always have to, but if you are going to, Trevor Lawrence would be my pick. And now we enter this last tier where I personally would not recommend, I hope you don't have to take any of these quarterbacks, but in case you do, you should be prepared. Davis Mills just missed the cut of that last group of quarterbacks. He's currently, though, being selected as the 29th quarterback. I'm at 25. He barely missed that last cut. So if you, for some reason, get to this range, he's a great value. Wentz and Goff are there. I would avoid them personally. They're 27, 28. I put Deshaun Watson in this tier. He used to be in about or 7. I think it was about 7 because I just didn't know about the suspension, but I would not recommend selecting him personally. There's just too much risk with a potential suspension. I mean, it's really worst case scenario. He's not being picked as a starting quarterback anyways. He is that when he's on the field, but he's not being selected that anyways. So if you're picking him as a backup to not play anyways, just let somebody else do that. And if he gets suspended, have a wasted roster spot, just let somebody else do it. So if he was actually playing, for sure, he's easily closer to a top 10 QB. But given the current situation, don't draft him. I have him in the red for that reason. Just don't. I just threw him in this tier because he could end up playing, but I had to include him, but don't pick him. Tier 10 are guys that I think will have a starting job, but the question is how long and maybe even where. Mariota is fine. He's got some mobility, but I'm passing on him. Baker's just, I threw him in there because he could get traded to Seattle, and then he's a starting QB, and he jumps up to that tier 9, maybe even tier 8 range, but Jacoby Brissett this week I just decided to throw in there because he really rose. So potential option. I mean, could swap him to Watson if you want in the rankings. Probably, hopefully you don't get to picking at that point, but if you really had to, he's probably going to be a starter. Darnold I would easily pass on. I can't believe Trubisky is currently the ADP QB 22. Above a lot of young QBs. Trubisky might not even be the starter. He probably will, but not the whole season, I don't think. So I'm definitely down on him. Don't pick him. I was not a fan of Kenny Pickett coming out of the draft. I don't think he'll start right away. He could, though, so I put him in that same tier, but pass on him. Garoppolo I wanted to put in tier 10, but I don't know what's going to happen to him now. Very slim chance maybe he gets traded to Seattle. I really don't think so. That's the only starting spot he could go, so I don't think anything happens there. And then Drew Lock could end up starting. Don't draft him. If you get to dynasty purposes, Pickett is a good pick, but specifically I want to highlight Matt Corral. He, I think, has a chance to even take the starting job this year from Sam Darnold. So if you need to in a dynasty league, I might say pick Corral, almost the highest of any rookie, QB, in my personal opinion, for dynasty fantasy purposes. Super high upside. I compared him to a quicker Jameis Winston coming out of the draft this year. And so for fantasy, that's a lot better than Kenny Pickett's comparison I had, which was Mitchell Trubisky, ironically. So keep an eye out for Corral. If you're in a dynasty league, end of the draft, I mean, I like that. Well, thank you so much for watching this video with the fantasy quarterbacks. I'll be back with probably running backs next. I'm hoping that my advice can get you some fantasy championships this season. So I'm Riley's Red Zone, and I'll see you in the next one.